Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to be continuing on with this week's theme of exceptionally long song titles with yet another exceptionally long song title. I say that all the time. It's so dumb. Of course. Anyways, this one comes at us from Santiago Puyol. Says we need to give Sufjan Stevens another try with "Come On, Feel the Illinoise." Part 1, The World's Columbian Exposition. Part 2, Carl Sandburg Visits Me in a Dream. Alright. What is this doing over here? Wait, that's supposed to be over there. Okay. I don't know anymore. Let's go. Let's see what Sufjan Stevens bringing this time. The last time we checked him out, it was the Tanya Harding song. And it wasn't too exceptional on the musical side. It was more about the lyrics, I suppose, and it didn't really hit me that strongly. Not really knowing who Tanya Harding was, or the story behind, the story behind, or that led to the song. So let's see what he's going to bring this time. I hear he's got a lot of facets to his writing. Yeah.
Got the best of interventions, but when the ads come, I think about it now. In my infliction, entrepreneurial conditions take us to glory. I think about it now. Get our conversations, applications, celebrate the ancients, get our all creation, call it celebration for United Nations, put it to your head.
What was that, like 5, 6 instruments sharing the same rhythmic element?
Where have your walls gone? I think about it now. Chicago in fashion, the soft drinks expansion of Columbia. From Paris, incentive, like cream of
Lots of texture blending. I'm really digging that. Alright, so there's an alternating between bars on whether you emphasize the downbeat or the offbeat, and I'm really digging that as well.
God of progress, have you degraded or forgot us? Where have your laws gone? I think about it now. Ancient hieroglyphic or the South Pacific, typically terrific, dizzy and prolific, classical devotion, architect.
Actually, I take that back. It can be felt that way, but it's also, I think, designed to be in a 5 pulse, and the 5 pulse retains the emphasized beat. Interesting sort of back and forth between strength and airier instruments, I guess you could. Lighter. And we've moved into 4 now. Is this the part 2? I suppose this is going to be part 2, the Carl Sandburg section. There's certainly a lot going on here. Interesting, the drum really only emphasizes beat 4. It helps really give it sort of that dragging feeling. I mean, especially contrasted against the high energy of the previous section. It just sort of elevates that idea. And I'm pretty sure that trumpet part, well, it's gone now. I'm pretty sure that was sort of like a carryover from the last section. There's that trumpet part. That legato trumpet section, or trumpet part, I think is from the first section as well.
Last night, for the earth and materials, they may sound just right to me.
What an odd way to end that. Yeah, there is a lot to really enjoy here. Even as far as I mean, how do you classify this? You know, on the surface, if we look at just mostly the vocal work and you know, maybe some of the lead lines and how they kind of work against the vocals and maybe the rhythmic elements to the drums, we could probably classify this in the pop section. But once you start really looking at a lot of what's going on with the layering and the texture work, I think it's really difficult to classify this as pop. It is pop sounding, definitely, but I don't know if I could straight up say that this is pop music. I think it's missing, it's kind of, I don't want this to come off the wrong way, and it's going to. I think it's too complicated for pop. I think one of pop's defining uh, ideas is more in simplicity. It's more about getting a lot out of a little. And this gets a lot out of a lot. So I think it's pop adjacent. But I don't know if I would call this a pop song. And that really, it makes me question, you know, what is this? We have some really strong classical elements in here with the way that instruments are layered and played against each other. We have texture work from classical, but we also have just really upbeat, kind of folky ideas and rhythms in the beginning. That first section, and it almost has like a bit of a swingness to it, right? It's not swing. We're not using swing eights, and we're definitely not using swing or jazz style chord progressions, but it has like some swing feels to it. I think if somebody described it as swing, I would not completely discredit it. It definitely feels swingy. So it's all over the place, really. It's got these elements of everything. I'm really loving that. It sort of sits in this, I don't know. it sits in a place that's a little bit of a lot of things. It doesn't really kind of commit to anything. Um, and I really appreciate that. I do. But let's talk about some actual parts of the song here. And I really want to focus on, to begin with, the rhythmic qualities in part one, the world's Columbian Exposition. Um, or at least that's how I'm going to define it. There were two very distinct parts. We had our 5 pulse and then our 4 pulse. We had our hyper, offbeat, kind of poppy, and then our sort of slower 4 pulse um, section. And that's part one and part two. The song literally has part one and part two in its name. So the fact that there's two very defined sections, that's how I'm going to do that. So I think it's really difficult to talk about both of them without talking about each individually first. Because some of the cool things that come together when we talk about them as an entire idea stem from understanding them as single sections. So that's how we're going to approach this one. So we're going to look at part one. I really want to emphasize, I think the strengths of part one is its rhythmic synergy. There are several sections that all follow the boop doop doop boop boop doop doop boop kind of idea. Why am I counting that as like 4? I I might have forgotten that major line, that main line, because I think that what I just sung was from the second part. Anyways, I'm sure you know that rhythm. It was played like the entire 3 minutes of that section. It's kind of impossible to have missed it. There was one part where like 3 vocalists, the guitar, a string, the drum, like they were all doing it at the same time. There's no way that you could have sort of missed this rhythmic concept. It is just so prevalent through the beginning. And it sort of sums up that sort of poppiness, that fun bounciness that the first section has. And it's used so much, but the interesting thing is it never gets old. At least not for me. I'm sure some people listen to it and after the first minute they're like, geez, let's move on. And normally that would be me. All right, we've talked about this before. I am not a huge fan of repetition. Well, excessive repetition, I would say. Excessive is obviously, subjective, but excessive repetition is not something I'm typically fond of. But Sufjan manages to keep things interesting throughout, either by cycling that rhythmic concept through different textures, different instruments, different combinations of instruments, or changing up the harmonies that are within it. Even there right at the beginning, I had mentioned that we started off with a couple of instruments doing it, and then he brought in like 6. Like we had a choir, a female choir, we had a male vocal on the low end, and then like a string and a trumpet and a drum, and they kind of really solidified it. And the sound got kind of narrow there because a lot of instruments were kind of honing in on these specific beats. And then as soon as they did that for like 2 bars or whatever, everybody started doing their own thing again, and it just expands, right? The sound gets bigger, and that is a change. That is a dynamic. And dynamics is really what's going to make repetitive sections seem less repetitive. You have to change things up. That's what dynamics is. Anything is changing, man. You can have volume dynamics, you can have rhythmic dynamics, you can have range dynamics, and he just kind of plays with all of them, right? We get that sound, that rhythm in multiple instruments, which means we get multiple textures, multiple timbres, multiple note ranges. Sometimes we have 2 instruments that are playing harmonies in there, and we get the textures of the harmony plus the textures of the timbre mixed in with everything else that's going on. The drum might, accent those beats on his snare, and then the next time he's doing it on the tom, and then the floor, and then the hi-hat or something. And it's just, he created a 3-minute song out of a single idea, and it never gets repetitive. And that is just, to me, that's sort of phenomenal. Because, like I said, I'm one to get bored of repetition quickly. We've talked about this a lot. Anytime we've listened to a song that either doesn't change often or maybe it's a slow burn, I once I've really dug into a section and I've analyzed it, and I felt that I have got a sufficient understanding of what's going on, I'm usually ready to hear something new. And the length that it takes me to understand a section changes. All right. As we listened yesterday, we had a ton of layers. I couldn't even dig through it on my first listen. But sometimes we get something, if this had less instruments, if this had less change, less dynamics, I would have been, thoroughly analyzed the section as far as what I would intend to for a first time listen and be ready for something else. But he never gives me that opportunity. Now, I don't know what the longevity for this song would be for me over a long period of time. How often can I listen to this? How many times can I listen to this before I get bored of it? I don't know. But on a first time listen, it tends to impress me if you can do the same thing all, for an extended period of time and not get me bored. That's just something that's going to impress me every time. Just playing with dynamics, because I think dynamics is one of the few things that a lot of modern um, popular genre writers tend to leave out, especially since a lot of popular music tends to have smaller timbre pools. You look at metal music, and we have a vocalist who might have two timbres. We might have a harsh and a clean, and then we have the guitar, the bass, and the drums. That's really not a lot of sounds to play with. You look at pop music. You have your vocalist, who typically has one style, and then your lead synth, maybe a bass synth, and then your drum synth. Again, not a lot of things to play around with. Um, Although pop does get away with samples and electronic modulation, so we do see some interesting things in pop, but usually not all that often because, like I said earlier, I feel that one of pop's defining traits is getting a lot out of a little. The less that you can put in and the bigger emphasis you can get out of it, then you should go with that. I don't think we really see a lot of electronic modulation in the majority of popular pop. There's definitely stuff on the fringe of pop that definitely could explore other realms of electronica music and sort of changing things up. The same goes for metal, I suppose. You have your two string instruments that can be electronically changed with effects and stomp pedals and stuff like that. But usually, your guitarist or bassist, they're going to find a tone and stick with it, and maybe have a secondary or third tone for some variety, but not usually a lot. And it's usually more of an offset. Like if we're going to a quiet section, I'm going to use the second tone, not a second or a third heavy tone. They have their signature tone for their heavy sections and a signature tone for a softer section, maybe a signature tone for a solo. Um, so it's not really something they can swap in and out. It's more of a defined tone for what's happening. Um, so because of that, outside of classical, we really don't see a lot of modern music being written with dynamics in mind. Volume is probably the most widely used, and it's also sadly sort of an on and off switch, where you are either quiet or you are soft, and you have your two extremes. Um, I think prog is kind of one of the few sections, the few genres that are really playing around with or not volume dynamics. So yeah, I kind of went on a tangent there, but that's why I enjoy dynamic work in music, even if it's something supremely simple like this. It's 3 minutes of the same thing, um, and it excites me. I'm happy to listen to it. I enjoy listening to it. I appreciate it because it's a lot of playing with dynamics, something that I just don't get to hear that much unless I specifically tune into, a handful of genres or I start looking at other time periods and stuff like that. So yeah, hearing dynamic work in pop, in metal, in rock, I'm just instantly gonna love it. All right, that's just good stuff. That is right up my alley. Now, part two is a bit interesting because it is a bit of a contrast to part one. We slow it down. We drop from a 5 pulse to a 4 pulse. Um, and it has less of an upbeat kind of, let's have fun bounciness to it, and more of a bit of a somberness to it, I think. It's not sad, but it's not happy either. Definitely somewhere in between. And but the interesting thing is that so many of the ideas and concepts, timbres, textures that we saw in part one are showing up in part two as well. So there is still a thread, sort of a DNA that is interweaves both of them into a single idea. Um, Even though we do have, the tempo shift and the time signature change, we still have the same instruments, though. The same instruments are kind of carrying the same ideas. We're hearing some of the ideas being brought over, but maybe translated from a 5 pulse idea to a 4 pulse. Maybe it drops uh, the last beat of the prior one, or maybe it reworks it just a little bit to fit within a 4 beat bar rather than a 5 beat bar. Um, but they find little ways to bring homages in. And between the texture continuation, we have all the same instruments. A lot of those instruments are carrying the same ideas conceptually in the second part. And then we also have these ideas that are just being repurposed for the end. It doesn't feel like that big of a change. And I love that because I don't have the language to explain that one. Like on paper, these are two wildly different sections. But when you listen to them, they're not really. There's a little bit of an emotional change. The soundscape is changed a little bit as far as the emotion that's being portrayed. Like I said, we went from kind of bouncy to a little more somber, a little more weighted, a little heavier, but they don't feel like two separate songs. They're definitely two sides of the same coin, and I just love that. The way that he employs so many characteristics of the first, and it's just the subtle changes that alter the way we perceive it emotionally. Like I said, I don't really see much of a dividing line between the music, but it's the emotion that I really get a driving sense for. One specific part I want to talk about, and I'm surprised I remembered it. When it came on, I was like, I need to talk about this first before we go into anything, or else I will forget. And I didn't, but I didn't forget, so I'm excited about that. We had a bit of a call and response back and forth, and I mentioned something about it being like strong versus weak or airy or something like that. And it was really interesting because we had the trumpets and strings, these big, booming, wide sounds doing the call, and the response was coming at us from what sounded to be like a xylophone, some sort of steel bell, and a flute, maybe. And that's all I can remember, honestly. And it was just like this booming call and then this timid response. And it was just such an interesting decision to go with, I think, because it really created a dynamic in that section where it's sort of like a mid piece, right? The beginning was big and booming and poppy and just in your face, and the ending was a bit more somber, little less big fanfare. And this was kind of the middle part. This is what transitioned us. We had the big calling to the small and going back and forth until we made that transition, and now we were at the quieter section. So that's just a really cool thing he did there. Um, I don't know if I really got anything else to say specifically. I went on a lot about part one, not so much about part two, but I'm kind of forgetting some of the nuances I wanted to talk about in part two. Um, Definitely something I'd like to go back and listen to for a second time and really focus in on part one, knowing what's coming up in part two. I think that would be really interesting and kind of seeing some of the similarities there, because I listened to part two having heard part one, and I can kind of trace some lineage there, some ideas that two got from one, but maybe there's some ideas in part one that reference or are kind of inspired by stuff that happens in part 2. Part 2 does have some really cool layering bits, but like I said, I can't really remember any specifics. Its layering was a lot better than part 1, though, which, obviously wasn't part 1's focus. Part 1's focus was about dynamics, mostly texture dynamics, and kind of marrying a bunch of sounds, utilizing a singular rhythmic concept. Part 2 was more about like a post-rock kind of slow burn, kind of getting a lot of ideas into a single space. It's really cool, though, how those two ideas can come together and form a single song, kind of share the same DNA despite being so different. Really digging that. All right, so yeah, I enjoyed this a lot more than Tonya Harding, which is to be expected. Not really knowing the lyrical aspect of Tonya Harding. Like I said, the music was not anything extravagant. It was more of an emotive song, I think, if you know the lyrics. And the music was there to provide a soundscape, so to speak. This one had a lot of musical stuff to talk about. You could really hone in on the music and get a lot out of it without knowing what's going on lyrically. So, but yeah, this is where you guys come in. I let you know my thoughts. You can let me know yours. Hit me up in the comments. All right, what did you think of Sufjan Stevens' Come On, Feel the Illinoise, Part 1, The World's Columbian Exposition, Part 2, Carl Sandburg Visits Me in a Dream? Did you enjoy it? Did you not enjoy it? What do you think of that name, the title? Golly. I like putting the two parts in the title, but I have no idea what they have to do with each other, or what any of that has to do with Illinois. Actually, it just kind of irritates me now that I realize it's Illinois. I do like how he spelled out noise, though, instead of just leaving it Illinois, because I think the pun would have been lost on me then. All right. Starting to ramble now. Let's finish this guy up. After you're done with the comments, there's a description box if you want to check any links adjacent to the channel, such as links to Patreon or blocked videos and stuff like that. Bunch of links in there. Go ahead and check that one out. If you want to be notified when I put another one out, you can go ahead and like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Doing those 3 will definitely get you the notifications, and they help out the channel immensely. YouTube algorithm, blah, 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 blah. Otherwise, you can always check in the channel at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC. That is when I upload new videos. Tomorrow will be the next random selection from the poll. We'll see another one, and then Friday will be my personal selection from the poll. And then Saturday and Sunday will be the special selections as usual. Until next time, you guys stay safe out there. Have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening. No, why can't... Until next time, you guys stay safe out there, keep being awesome, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.